Okay, I think I'm going to get started. People are still coming in, so those of you who are already logged on, welcome. My name is Maya Tarashvili. I'm a Deputy Director of Research here at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. As you already know, today we will be talking about the protests, the unrest, and the political crisis in Kyrgyzstan. I am joined by my colleagues. I would like to welcome Venera Djumaeva, who is calling in from Bishkek. She is the director of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Kyrgyz Service. I also have Max Hess here calling in from London. He's our Central Asia Fellow. And I also have Niva Yao calling in as well from Bishkek as well. And she is a fellow here at FPRI, which is a new development. So I'd like to welcome, give special warm welcome to Niva. I think we can just get started. Venera, I want to turn to you and ask you to give us some background on the situation, how the unrest unfolded, what happened with the parliamentary election that led to this situation, and where things stand right now, because the events have been developing so quickly. But before we go into that, I want to mention that this discussion is co-sponsored by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which is a new partnership for us at FPRI. So I would like to welcome them and thank them for partnering up with us. With that, Venera, I will turn over to you.
Thank you. I just have to say I'm based in Prague, Czech Republic. That's where Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's headquarters are. As many of you, or majority of people already know, the parliamentary elections on October 4th led to mass protests in Bishkek. Opposition parties, the 16 parties were running in those elections, and almost 12 of them were left out, according to latest results. And the three pro-government parties took the majority of seats in the new parliament, and that sparked huge protests and anger. And that anger, popular anger, was not built only on parliament elections results. That anger was built on complete inaction by the Kyrgyz authorities during this pandemic. June, July turned out to be very tragic months in Kyrgyzstan, when thousands of people were infected and they had nowhere to go for help. Many people were dying. According to official statistics, more than 1,000 people died, but we know we, RFRL, were covering every day, and so we know that that number, real number, is much higher. People were dying in villages and they didn't know what their diagnosis were. They were just dying from short of breath, and people were burying, they had no people to bury those people, you know. So there was very big tragedy in June, July. People were angry about how authorities dealt with that pandemic. Also, they were angry about the ignorance of many calls to fight against corruption. We, RFRL Kyrgyz Service, together with OCCRP and CLOP news agency in Bishkek, we covered big, mass-scale corruption scheme on the Kyrgyz-Chinese border, where hundreds of cargos every day were bringing Chinese goods, and all of them were using corruption scheme at the Kyrgyz Customs Service to pay a little bit to those corrupt officials, but do not pay just maybe very little money to the state budget. So escaping all kind of possible customs taxes, instead enriching the corrupt officials. That was happening for years and years. And we covered that using all documents and everything. And the main witness, main information source, was murdered in Istanbul in November 2019. You know, such things were happening. People knew all of that, but authorities were completely ignorant. And those elections on October, of course, they became the main engine when many hundreds of young people, progressive young people, they said, we cannot take it. We cannot take such results, such fraud and vote buying and use of administrative resources. It was very obvious. Nowadays, not journalists, but ordinary people are covering day in and day out what's happening on the ground. You know, they were publishing on Kyrgyz language social media endless videos how people, those members of pro-government parties, how they were buying votes, etc. And of course, during these protests, mass protests on October 5, when people entered the White House, and they didn't need to like fight with somebody to enter White House. Everybody left apparently. Before there were very bad bloody clashes on the streets. But when people entered the White House, it was not guarded. There was nobody to stop them. And they entered the National Security Committee's building, which should be the best protected building in Kyrgyzstan, but they also entered that building without big resistance. And then Sadir Japarov, now he's acting president and prime minister at the same time. It never happened before in modern Kyrgyz history when one person would take so much power in his hands. So he was released from prison where he was serving the 10-year sentence for alleged kidnapping or taking hostage of the official. So he was released along with other politicians, and including former President Atambayev. And it happens in recent Kyrgyz history that when whoever comes first to the main square and says, "I am the victor," then that person takes power, unfortunately. And so, I mean, Sadir Japarov was building for years his big army of supporters using social media. During his last press conference in Bishkek last week, he said he has more than 10,000 contacts on his mobile phone and 50-something groups on WhatsApp. In each group, they have thousands of people. So he was building his army on those years when he was in prison, around about 4 years in prison. And before that, he was in exile, living in Poland and Russia. So all these years, he didn't waste time, and he was building a very big army of supporters who were very moved by his nationalist slogans, like nationalizing the Kumtor gold mine, largest gold mine in Kyrgyzstan, second largest in Central Asia. He would make such calls like, we have to nationalize Kumtor gold mine, we have to take over all gold mines from foreign companies, or he would say, we have to write in our passports that we are Kyrgyz by nationality. So very, very, how to say, very populistic slogans and promos he made. And thousands and thousands of people, Kyrgyz-speaking people in migration in Russia, in migration in Turkey or Kazakhstan, and in Kyrgyzstan, in regions, they were moved by his such slogans. And he, of course, he used some very popular slogans against establishment, that parliament is very bad, parliament members are doing nothing, government members are doing nothing, we will fight against corruption, we will make all these rich officials and former officials to pay for what they have stolen from the government and from people, etc. So he built up very smart, let's say, policy on social media, and that's how we see now the Sadir Japarov has gained very big popularity, and nobody, including the very veteran politicians like Tekebayev, who was also in prison, or I don't know, other Madumarov and other politicians, nobody could compete with him. He brought not, I would say, not like 10,000 people to the streets, but he brought some, let's say, up to 5,000 people, the largest crowd, but they were very aggressive, they were very violent, and people were afraid going against them. We, FPRI's Kyrgyz service, were under massive online attack. I've never seen such online attacks on us. Like, they were threatening to burn down our office, to destroy our office, to attack us, journalists. just because we were publishing last week materials questioning the legitimacy of Sadr Japarov's titles or status, we were questioning what happened to his criminal case, how it come he has all power in his hands. It not us, but many politicians, many experts, locals, they were questioning such things, they were putting such questions, and we were covering all of that. And we became under enormous attack, and we had to complain to police, we had to say publicly that we are being attacked, etc. So it's the first time in my journalistic history that we were facing such enormous attack online. So it is still a little bit violent, I would say, but Sadr Japarov lately trying to bring all kind of political groups together. Latest his appointments, he's taking people from opposition Social Democrats party, even let's say former President Atambayev's party. He appointed one person today to be the Director General of the public TV radio company. And he's taking other people from opposition parties. He's taking people from pro-government parties. So at least his latest moves show that he's trying to consolidate power, consolidate different political groups. I don't know how long, and he made some very popular statements in his video address to people that he will fight against corruption. He named this very notorious Matreimov's clan by name. Soronbay Jeenbekov never named Matreimov in his statements, and Japarov is naming them. So people really liked his first ever video statement addressed to people. He made some very, let's say, consolidating statements in his, he said he will create a commission on reforms. He said he will start cutting the, saving money from for state budget, cutting his own presidential administration and government structure, etc. So he made some, let's say, positive statements lately. He's not very, I would say, he's not a great speaker. He's not very experienced politician, but he's building his own team right now. And we see some smart people, some intellectual people. So if they will help him to build some really like smart and progressive policy, then we will be, I mean, more people will be accepting him and his policy. So far, I mean, right now, this week, Sadr Japarov and the authorities, parliament, they have to announce new date for parliamentary election and for early presidential elections. Therefore, there were talks that they have to happen at the same day to save money for budget. So we don't know. The parliamentary elections, re-elections, should be held in December, and presidential election latest January. So we will have 2 elections at least in upcoming months. Again, it will be a very hot political season for Kyrgyzstan. And so there are different inclinations, like Sadr Japarov's appointments are making some already disappointment among people, because he's not alone. He's working in tandem with Kamchibek Tasheev. And they were both very high officials during fugitive ex-President Bakiyev's regime. So there are questions, are they cooperating with some outside forces, where they're getting their money from, who is funding all these thousands of people, protesters in Bishkek. They were all given food and they were staying in hotels. So we don't know, we have to find answers to many questions still. But at least we see some, some appointments by this tandem, let's say Japarov Tasheev, raised questions again about nepotism, about corruption, because the governor of Jalalabad, newly appointed, apparently he's relative to Kamchibek Tasheev. So there are lots of questions, and we will still analyze and look for answers everywhere. But at least some statements and some appointments are making Sadr Japarov look that he's trying to consolidate political powers.
Thank you, Venera. I think that was so important and so useful for us to really get a sense of the background, but also of the situation right now. I want to turn to Niva. We're going to be talking quite a bit about the geopolitical implications of this situation in Kyrgyzstan and of what we expect will happen with the new government, which is most likely going to be led by Japarov. Niva, I want to ask you, what is the sense in Bishkek right now? The people who are demonstrating, who were protesting, is this the outcome they were hoping for? And then from that, I'd like to transition into China's interest in the region. What are the implications of this political change for China's relationship and business interests in Kyrgyzstan and in that space?
Well, first of all, thank you, Venera, for talking to us. That was probably one of the best summaries so far, even though, you know, I live here and we talk about every day. That was a really good summary of all the key developments. Regarding the supporters here, I have to say, in Bishkek city center, I've been seeing a lot of unfamiliar faces that obviously a lot of people from outside of Bishkek have all of a sudden gathered in the city center. My sentiment regarding some of my Kyrgyz middle class friends is that, you know, I think, you know, Venera really pointed it out, you know, quite importantly is that Japarov has this army of social media groups that really recirculate information, and it touches absolutely everywhere, every spectrum of society. So everyone knows kind of Japarov's you know, his views and his entire story, that you know, how he was a good man, but he was, you know, falsely accused, and that's why he went to prison. And a lot of people do believe that. There's a lot of, you know, online circulation regarding that. And yes, I mean, with us seeing that, you know, it is going to be a Japarov-led government, what does this mean for China? Well, for China, the top political objective in Kyrgyzstan is to make sure that the Kyrgyz government doesn't support the separatist movement in Xinjiang. So far, and Venera later can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure she's monitoring this every single day. And so far, Japarov and his, you know, top people hasn't really said anything about how they see the situation in Xinjiang. And I believe that no Kyrgyz leadership will dare to oppose the treatment of Uyghurs or even ethnic Kyrgyz in Xinjiang. However, it is a big sentiment that Japarov can use, because there are groups in Bishkek that, you know, support, you know, their families or their, you know, relatives, you know, that have witnessed what happened in Xinjiang, and they do protest outside the Chinese embassy or in the city center, for example. So it is a sentiment that Japarov can use, but I doubt Japarov would use that, because in the past 3 months, we have seen the Kyrgyz government, led by Jeenbekov, repeatedly asking for debt relief from the Chinese government. And debts are piling up, and it is Japarov's government that will have to address that. So I highly doubt that Japarov will dare to say anything to China, because Japarov will have to ask China in the coming months to relieve these debts. But regarding long-term or medium to long-term goals, of course, China is looking at Kyrgyzstan like it is fitting all the boxes. You know, there's already this sentiment within Chinese investors in this country that, you know, Kyrgyzstan is very unstable, and other countries in Central Asia are developing and are, you know, having really good policies, welcoming investors and so on and so forth. Why stay here? A lot of investors are leaving. They constantly feel unsafe living in the capital or elsewhere. So when this whole political unrest broke out, a lot of there's a Chinese private security company here that rushed to different parts of Kyrgyzstan, including, you know, a project by China Railway Group in Songkho, in the Issyk area, and they had additional staff rushed in on the day on the 9th of October, just because they were afraid of their equipments and their storage unit getting attacked. So China, view Kyrgyzstan as a country that is constantly unsafe, and it's been kind of implementing a lot of measures to protect the businesses and protect the assets. So is in the future, China is not going to address this, corruption problem that contributes to anti-Chinese sentiment and also contribute to political instability. And this is not something that, China will address anywhere in the world, or even drastically address, within China. So we have this paradox where corruption drives political instability in Kyrgyzstan and also drives this insecurity for Chinese investments. But for China, it is not really going to do anything. And even Jeenbekov, use a lot of these big words, and like Venera said, mentioned how he's going to get Matraimov and all that. I think if Jeenbekov do get Matraimov, it would be in China's interest, because China has been wanting to implement the railway connecting China, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan for some 20 years now. But one of the main reasons why China, or even Uzbekistan, when Uzbekistan expressed interest into jointly implementing this project some years ago, it is still a deadlock in Kyrgyzstan, because the Matraimov clan controls the southern part of the customs, and with this railway, it is going to modernize the entire system of customs, and it's not going to allow this sort of corruption. So if Jeenbekov do target the Matraimovs, we are going to really see some changes with China-Kyrgyz trade, bilateral trade, especially regarding products going through the borders in the south.
Thank you so much, Niva. I think that was that gave us a really good sense of China's interests there. And of course, the next big player in the region, which is Russia. Max, how does Russia see this? How does this affect Russia's relationship with Kyrgyzstan? And what kind of relationship does Moscow have with Jeenbekov?
Certainly. So I would begin by saying where we stand right now is that Moscow has formally said it is suspending financial assistance to Kyrgyzstan. There has been some minor statement from the head of the Russian military command in Central Asia. It covers both the bases in Kant in Kyrgyzstan, not far from the capital, and also in Tajikistan, about sort of the upgrading of military equipment, including helicopters. I don't think that Russia is looking to intervene militarily in any way. One thing that I think is sometimes missed and is often forgotten about, given the history of the color revolutions, including Kyrgyzstan's own tulip revolution in 2005, is that while those three examples in Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan were certainly geopolitical setbacks for Moscow, Moscow often has proven its ability in the post-Soviet space, including in Central Asia, to increase its position and take advantage of unrest or sort of political disturbances. Perhaps the best example of this was in 2010, where there was the second Kyrgyz revolution against the Bakiyev regime, as Venera already discussed. And what we saw Moscow come in and really eventually able to establish quite a good relationship with the new authorities. Although at first Rosa Otunbayeva, the interim president, was kind of seen as more pro-West. Atambayev, the Kyrgyz president then, who preceded Jeenbekov and is now back in jail after also having briefly been freed during all the unrest, was able to establish a very good relationship with Moscow. A number of Russian mining companies expanded their operations in Kyrgyzstan during that time. Perhaps most importantly, we saw Gazprom's full takeover of the Kyrgyz gas networks. Both Japarov and Tashiev, who Venera mentioned, who's now serving as the head of the GKNB, the State Security Agency, and is a very powerful figure, served under the Bakiev regime and had quite senior roles in there. Moscow, I think, is very much aware also of this nationalist bent to the current rising power to Japarov and his allies. You know, Japarov not only made his name talking about the nationalization of the Kumtor gold mine, which is majority owned actually by a Canadian company, a Canadian listed company, at least, but also in his nationalist bent more broadly. He, you know, speaks Kyrgyz in most of his public appearances rather than Russian. But the Russians certainly, I think, have the feeling that they can find a way to deal with this new government. I don't think that there's going to be any real possibility that Moscow's position will be hugely negatively impacted by this. Moscow will be keen to avoid further unrest when the next elections come. I do think they would have been even sort of more worried about their political position by the initial sort of youth aspect to the protest movement, the fact that there were many young Kyrgyz focused on the anti-corruption angle. As to the question of whether this government's agenda really is going to be anti-corruption, that's a very difficult question to answer at this stage. As Venera mentioned, maybe there have been some positive signs, but Tashiev also, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Venera, in comments he gave to RFERL when the investigations were coming out, he also essentially defended Matraimov at the time, saying that senior an official and he's a good guy and the like. Now he's spoken out against him. There's a number of questions over still what is going to happen next. Under the Kyrgyz constitution, as I understand it, the acting president should not be a candidate for president in the next elections. Of course, Japarov should not, under the Kyrgyz constitution, have ended up in the position that he is in now anyway. Both his, you know, freedom from jail and then the rise to the presidency from the prime ministership after the Speaker of Parliament said he would not take up the acting presidency following Jeenbekov's resignation. So, you know, right now I would say bets are that Japarov will find a way to run for the presidency. You know, I'm very interested in how large Tashiev's role ultimately is in these matters. He was the political figure, head of the Mekenchil or Patriot Party before the elections, which just narrowly, according to the official results, didn't make it in, but had previously been the main leader of Atajurt. He also had established a working political relationship at one point with Omurbek Babanov, another important Kyrgyz politician and kind of clan leader from the south. Reestablishing some of those ties with other politicians is very important for the north-south balance within Kyrgyzstan, but also will end up being important for dealings with Moscow. You know, I would not be entirely surprised if there was some kind of working relationship that ended up there, and that then enabled this new government to go back to dealing with Moscow. Moscow, if I don't want to presuppose that it is true, but if it is true that this new government really is just as corrupt, or in fact may have even more links to organized crime figures in the Matraimov clan, the Russians certainly are and have a long precedent of working very well with organized corruption groups, including in political manners. So, you know, Moscow's position, I think, is really unchallenged there. One of the interesting factors that we've seen, at least to me, is we haven't really seen any of the accusations of a color revolution that Russia usually trots out whenever there's any kind of unrest. There was some, you know, little things in Zvezda and nationalist media in the early days, but since I was just checking earlier, the Asia Times, a sort of pro-China outlet, is the only one with an article written by a former Indian diplomat about color revolutions, whereas you're not really finding that rhetoric there in Russia. So although it has suspended this financial aid, I think it's really just looking to jockey to make sure that not only does it certainly will retain its position, but that it may even be able to strengthen it. For example, if and this is one of the really big questions, I think, at least from a Western angle, is if there is a move to nationalize or once again change the ownership of Centerra Gold stake in the Kumtor gold mine. The reality is right now Kyrgyzstan does not have the real know-how and the marketing ability to go and sell that gold and mine efficiently. There would also be a negative impact on the market if it did take hostile action in nationalizing it. But Russia would therefore be a very willing partner in dealing with that, and could take the gold on and mix it with other gold and have it be easy. And just to quickly mention for our listeners why I think that's so important. For those who are unfamiliar, the Kumtor gold mine itself is in Issyk province in the northeast of Kyrgyzstan. That is also where Japarov himself hails from. But it contributes somewhere between 10 and 15% of gross domestic product every year, depending on how you calculate it. So although Kyrgyzstan is not as overall mineral wealthy a country as some of the other Central Asian states, you know, even if you take the largest oil and gas fields in Kazakhstan, for example, you know, as individual units, they're not as large a share of GDP as Kumtor is in Kyrgyzstan. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Max. While I have you, let me quickly ask you. Is one of the reasons why there's not much accusations of this being a color revolution the fact that the U.S. is largely absent from the scene, and really we're not seeing that much commentary from the West. So, you know, hopes of this being some form of a positive change towards democratic consolidation in Kyrgyzstan. We don't hear that kind of language. Do you think that factors into Moscow's perception? And let's ask this question too. What does this mean for the U.S. and what should the U.S. be doing right now?
Sure. Yes, I mean, we have seen some statements from the U.S. Embassy. I believe they've put out 3 now since the election itself, but none of them had sort of any implications, I think, about a preferred outcome. We've seen some statements of concern from the European Union as well. The sad reality of it is that one, the U.S.'s retreat in sort of its America First foreign policy in recent years has really left Kyrgyzstan off the agenda. Although we saw Pompeo travel to the region earlier this year, very quickly thereafter, we also saw the U.S. take away some visa rights for Kyrgyz and accuse them of chronic overstaying of their visas. Now, there are more people from the province of Alberta in Canada who have overstayed their visas in the United States by a significant amount than there are Kyrgyzstan total, just because of you know, the overall traveler numbers. So I don't think that that's a sort of genuine concern personally. I think that very much has to do with this insular move on the United States' part. Overall, the U.S. right now is not that interested in sort of really pursuing a strong agenda there, and whether the interest mostly did come from over the last 20 years, really related to often the conflict in Afghanistan as well, with its use of the Manas Eres up until Atambayev, as part of his sort of moving closer to Russia, took that lease away. So, you know, it's very much off the U.S. agenda. In terms of the European agenda as well, I'd also just briefly mention, because it also applies to the U.S., and this is certainly a regrettable state of affairs, but you know, Eurasia overall is not nearly as high on the U.S. agenda as it once was, or in some ways on the European agenda. And with significant developments still going on in Belarus and the actions to sanction the Lukashenko regime and the development of sort of a new opposition there, as well as the tragedy of a new war in Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan sort of falls as third priority behind those countries for policymakers in Europe and in the United States. The US is obviously caught up in its election as well. You also have the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, which Venera talked about the impact domestically, but it's significantly, reshaped politics over much of the European Union and the United States as well. So the sad reality is that it's just not very high on the agenda, and I don't see it moving up the agenda in any way. So in some ways, I think you're right. That does allow Moscow not to be as worried about and need to use this kind of color revolution language. But at the same time, if Moscow thought that sort of the nationalism of the new government was going to be a real threat to its assets and its relationships and networks in the country, then they would use that language anyway. There are plenty of times we've seen Russia sort of invoke the specter of color revolution when it's not really anywhere near the story of what's going on. For example, in Belarus right now. And, we have to remember it's been a long time since there's been, a quote unquote color revolution. This is still a paradigm that's now been with us for 15 years. Of course, some in Moscow would probably argue that the Maidan and the Euromaidan in Ukraine was a color revolution, and that's a question for another time. But I wouldn't see it that way.
Thank you, Max. I cannot help but mention that while the US is largely absent from this region, we obviously have these developments in Kyrgyzstan, and we have an election coming up again in December. Moldova has a very important presidential election coming up November 1. Georgia has also a very important election coming up October 30th. And we still have this conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, sadly, where the ceasefire just hasn't really stuck. So all of these may look like small, isolated crises or important developments, but they're not, because Russia seems to have a pretty important role, overtly or covertly, in most of these developments. So I think the later part of this year is going to shape a lot of the landscape in terms of who has the upper hand in the Eurasia region when it comes to being able to influence policies and outcomes there. I want to combine the next two questions. I want to get to the audience Q&A. I want to encourage our audience members to submit their questions through Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I have two questions that I'm going to combine. One is, what do you think are Japarov's strengths and weaknesses as a leader? And then the second one talks about how, Max, you mentioned this, actually, I think each of you really mentioned how he's known as a nationalist leader. So, what is that going to mean in terms of his policies now that he has all the power to make these kinds of changes? What is the expectation? Venera, I want to turn to you first.
Yeah, the biggest strength of Sadr Japarov right now that he has all power in his hands. Yeah, he is acting president and prime minister, and also the parliament, which has been mostly controlled by the White House in Bishkek. Now it is controlled by Sadr Japarov, let's say. So he has all power, that's a strength, and he has his supporters. Not huge army, I would say, but several thousands of people. And the more statements he is making, more those army soldiers might turn back, their back toward him, because he already said, realizing that being in an official status, in official position, makes him speak correctly, politically correct. He's correcting already his previous nationalist statements. He said it is not on his agenda to nationalize Kuntur, he said publicly. And he said we cannot change constitution now, we cannot change laws, so we have to hold elections on time. So at least he's correcting himself. And the most important for all the community, for all progressive and democratic community in Kyrgyzstan and outside of Kyrgyzstan, to pursue him, to convince him to make him make some more such statements, to be in terms of constitution and all Kyrgyzstan's laws, because Kyrgyzstan's laws and constitution are much more pro-democratic than any other neighboring countries. So of course, the weakness of Sadur Japarov, that he was not in politics for many years. He occupied these positions, official positions during Bakiyev's regime for a short time. So as I said, he doesn't have big experience of being in politics. So he has to build his relations with leaders of neighboring countries if he stays in power. The Kyrgyz constitution clearly states that the acting president cannot run in presidential elections. So I think we might see some new combination in coming days, and maybe this week or next week, that it is possible that he would step down from acting president's role and will prepare himself to run in presidential elections, because Kyrgyzstan constitution right now, it doesn't allow him to run in presidential elections. If he has such ambitions, then he has to change his title. So we will see different combinations in coming days. So as I said, seems like he's building good team around himself. At least his first address to people sounded very reasonable, very adequate, and very appealing to people. So I would like to hope that he will make more such statements, and he will pronounce the word democracy. So far, he didn't pronounce such word yet. But even though Kyrgyzstan's laws and constitution, everything state that Kyrgyzstan is a democratic country and allows pluralism and freedom of speech and everything. So we will see in coming days. I think he will more and more correct himself. I wanted to say that his family, his ancestors, his parents moved from Chinese Xinjiang province in 1960s to Kyrgyzstan. So he has this history, and his nationalistic sentiment built up from there. We were analyzing between us journalists, and we thought that nationalistic sentiment comes from there. I mean, he was fed with those stories, in Xinjiang, how it was difficult for ethnic Kyrgyz people and why they moved in early 1960s to Kyrgyzstan, to Isiku. And also that makes, everybody is very careful now about him, China, Russia, and they all know his history and background and everything. So he has to make many, many corrections now. The Kyrgyzstan has over $4 billion foreign debt, and 42% of that belongs to China. So he has to build up very smart, very shrewd policy now to convince everybody, including China, Russia, and neighboring countries, that he will be a good and, let's say, diplomatically correct partner in all relations. Of course, Russia has lots of leverages to, let's say, to change Kyrgyz politics, but Russia's biggest concern that no politician comes claiming that Kyrgyzstan will be pro-Western or pro-democratic and country. That's the biggest concern for Moscow. So he didn't make such statements so far. But the progressive people, we have to remember, the US and the European countries, they have to remember that all these thousands of people, young people who came out to streets on October 4th and October 5th, they're all very progressive young people. And they're, let's say, the most intellectual and future decision makers in Kyrgyzstan. Their hopes and their dreams and their demands were to some extent stolen by let's say, Japarov-Tasheev tandem, but they are trying to correct themselves and to embrace those young people. Let's see if it happens to the extent acceptable by these young progressive people. We hope that will happen. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention one thing sort of on the geopolitics in response to some of what Venera said from the Russia and Western angle. Yes, I certainly agree that in Europe in particular, there is this sort of view for talk about democracy promotion and you know, progressive values. The current government in the United States, I do not think cares one tiny bit about those matters. Even in times where we do have more progressive governments in the United States, or have the importance of economic interests still is very significant. And the Venera gold ownership come to our mind, even under the most progressive U.S. government imaginable. I think if this government took real significant action against that mine, there would be real negative fallout. It would halt potential cooperation of OPIC, now the U.S. International Development Financial Center, World Bank, and other international financial institutions with the Kyrgyz government as well. During previous times of discussions around this, we've seen that role play in. Yes, I have seen that Japarov has dialed down his rhetoric on that matter compared to how it was a decade ago. I would note that the Venera gold share price is down some 20% since the beginning of these events. It's often been very volatile in line. Kyrgyz politics are doing quite well, just off the back of the fact that gold is very high, and I certainly think that the current administration is more receptive to complaints about economic interests in the U.S. than they are about complaints about democratic backsliding. For Russia, of course, you know, it also has its own mining interests and the like in the country. But while China, as Niva pointed out, its economic interests have really grown. It is the primary debtor to, the primary creditor to Kyrgyzstan, which has real, even before Japarov came to power, had essentially you know, made clear that it could no longer afford its debt load. Russia has written off a large number of the Kyrgyz debts in recent years, but it still remains the main security actor in the country. China, which has taken a more active security role in Tajikistan, for example, has broadly been happy with maintaining things there. We did see Russia donate some new military equipment to Kyrgyzstan over the last 2 years. Basically sort of the surplus of what was at its facilities to the local Kyrgyz security forces there, but it certainly has significant instruments of leverage there. You know, it's not for me to comment, and not having as much you know, experience on the ground, of course, as Niva and Venera, but you know, how sort of this regime is able to consolidate, and if it looks like Kyrgyzstan is going to go through multiple bouts of continued unrest, you know, if there's a new set of elections, and you know, as we saw with the investiture votes to bring Japarov in as prime minister, it was actually many of the MPs from the parties associated with Mataimov and Jeenbekov who ended up voting to bring him in. So if it ultimately is sort of just a reshuffling of elites, I think that might bring, you know, that has the potential to bring some of the youth back into the country as well. And then I still, you know, think that one of the other things that this government will need to do to consolidate its power, or perhaps Venera and Niva can comment on more, is how it's managed to bridge Kyrgyzstan's north-south divides with Jeenbekov, you know, very much a southerner, Mataimov, I believe, as well. But Japarov coming from the north. We did see protests in Osh, where the former mayor was flown back in and came out in support of Japarov, and who was sort of behind that plane and getting that organized so quickly, coming from Turkey, I believe, is another interesting question there as well. There was one question in the chat on Turkey's role there, and overall, I don't think Turkey, you know, while it has the cultural connections and there's a lot of Kyrgyz expatriates there, is not historically intervened as much domestically in Kyrgyz politics. Although now, as we see, you know, Turkey's growing foreign policy assertiveness from Libya to North Cyprus to Syria to Karabakh, you know, it may look to play a larger role shaping things going forward.
Thank you, Max.
If I can add something, yeah.
Sure.
We just heard that Kyrgyz foreign minister talked to Turkish foreign minister, and they discussed the state of bilateral relations. And Turkish foreign minister apparently is, said that Ankara is a little bit concerned about the role or involvement of pro-Gulen people in those all movements and changes. They consider some new government members in Kyrgyzstan as pro-Gulen people. I will not name them, but they are young people who were educated at Gulen funded schools, let's say. And then additionally to what I said earlier, I wouldn't say firmly that all these young progressive people's dreams and demands were stolen yet. We have to see how the parliamentary and presidential elections will be held. And if they will be held in a free and fair manner and according to all Kyrgyz laws, without using any administrative resource, without vote buying and other speculations, manipulations, then young people will be satisfied with results and they will accept results. And how the election rules will be changed in coming days, that also plays important role. And also, of course, one of the biggest demands coming from those young progressive people was lustration, to eliminate all former officials who were connected to corrupt regimes, to eliminate them from taking any official posts in the future. That's not going to happen, I think, because already some of them were appointed to new positions by Sadr Japarov. And even Sadr Japarov and Kamchibek Tashev might fall to that
and that
category
can
also.
be such a lengthy process too, right? To adopt lustration laws properly. I want to turn this over to Niva now. I have a question here. How do China and Russia's rivalry play out in Kyrgyzstan? Is there any indication that either power is actively supporting any of the candidates that are vying for power in Bishkek? We already talked about that portion, but Niva, maybe you could talk a little bit about, do Russia and China clash? Or are they sort of coexisting in Kyrgyzstan and their interests? And actually, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you see Russia and China in the region more broadly, because I see a lot of people mention this world rivalry. Does it apply to their role in Central Asia?
So, since, Venera also brought up and how the Kyrgyz new foreign minister met the Turkish ambassador. So the Kyrgyz new foreign minister also met the Chinese ambassador about 3 days ago. The China ambassador was more emphasizing on the security of Chinese companies in Kyrgyzstan because, a lot of them were robbed. Some Chinese businessmen were robbed from their apartments, and overall, the Chinese expat community in Bishkek is extremely tense. Just today, a gold refinery in Jalalabad was set on fire, the building. So that was extremely unacceptable, and is a lot of unrest and break-in has been happening since the 9th of October. So when Ambassador Du met the new Kyrgyz foreign minister, she was emphasizing on security. And from the statement released by the Chinese embassy, the Kyrgyz foreign minister first and foremost emphasized that the new Kyrgyz government will stand on China in terms of China's strategic core interests in the region, and will cooperate with China in international and regional organizations in terms of security. Now, reading in between the lines, this is saying that the new Kyrgyz government will not oppose China's, harsh stance in Xinjiang. And then after this statement, the Kyrgyz foreign minister said that, is trying to do whatever it can to help Chinese nationals and Chinese businesses. So Russia and China, regarding this political unrest, I think, one of the most immediate one would be, Venera was, kept emphasizing the young progressive people in Kyrgyzstan as the kind of leaders of tomorrow. I think that's correct. And I think that's, one of the, maybe the more long-term, development that China is watching, because so over this past week there were 2 op-eds in Chinese popular media that were published by Chinese think tank analysts, and one of them is Professor Lanzhou University, a kind of normal academic person, and the other one was published by Dr. Xu Tao, who was a former staff at the Chinese embassy in Uzbekistan, and his affiliation currently, the think tank in China, is directly under the Ministry of Public Security. So reading between the lines of these two different op-eds is actually really interesting that China, these scholars also don't mention color revolution, because I think it's quite obvious that it is just not. It is a domestic Kyrgyz development, and China recognized that. And even all the official Chinese statements recognize that it's not a color revolution. It's just not mentioned. So it was quite surprising to me that these scholars were able to analyze the situations completely accurately and completely detailed. One of the emphasis was actually on these young progressive people, because these scholars are actually aware that some of the students from the American university were also part of the protest, and they were saying that in the long term, because Kyrgyzstan welcome a lot of Western influence, and this Western influence is going to encourage the growth of progressive opposition that will contribute to political instability in the long term. Now, this is something that I think Russia also agree. And I think this is also the reason why Russia has been, spending a lot of money on the education sector in Kyrgyzstan as well in recent years, building, really large schools and so on and so forth. Now, it is not necessarily a competition or rivalry per se with regards to particular political unrest today. China slowly is actually giving up on Kyrgyzstan as a strategic country. In a way, China is understanding that Kyrgyzstan is a country that is always going to have political unrest and political instability, as analyzed by a lot of Chinese scholars, that Kyrgyz constitution and the Kyrgyz political makeup allowed instability. And unless this change, we're not going to see any sort of stability in Kyrgyzstan that, for example, Chinese scholars would say Kazakhstan have, or even to extreme extent Turkmenistan have, and it's something that we'll never see in Kyrgyzstan. So from a Chinese commercial perspective, so long as Chinese foreign policy backed by economic power, we are not going to see China really stepping up and valuing Kyrgyzstan if this political instability goes on. And in that sense, China is not really, there's nothing really at stake here for China really to care. Of course, unless Kyrgyzstan take a 360 and say that they now stand with the West against the situation in Xinjiang. That okay, then China, but Kyrgyzstan won't do that. There's 2 billion debts that China is holding, and there is just completely no way. The Kyrgyz economy itself relies so much on importing products from China and then exporting elsewhere. So as soon as China cut off that kind of route for money, and China can, there's only 2 borders that that Kyrgyzstan can get products from China. So there's simply no cards that any of the new or the future Kyrgyz governments can play with regards to China. So whether or not China actually care about Kyrgyzstan it is not up to any sort of developments that will emerge. It is everything that's happened now has already made China kind of lost faith in this country. So as long as it doesn't develop so badly into a hub for terrorists, China is not going to intervene, because it has already chosen a different route to go to Kazakhstan and then to Uzbekistan, and new developments show Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, even linking back to Iran. So Kyrgyzstan is completely isolated. Now, however, I think, in terms of Russia, Russia and China is having these little rivalries within the SCO in terms of, the kind of logistics that networks that China want to implement. So for example, because, China value diversity, so it is going to want to go from Kazakhstan downwards to Turkmenistan and to Uzbekistan, and then through the Caspian Sea, and not have Russia dominate the entire logistics network going from China westward all the way to Europe. And Kyrgyzstan doesn't necessarily come into this as much, especially because it's so, considered by China as politically unstable. The railway is unlikely to happen unless Japarov really take a harsh stand on corruption and arrest Matraimov and somehow prove to the world that it is really improving its governance, then maybe the railway might happen. But even then, that is not really going to threaten Russia as much, because Kyrgyzstan allowing this pathway to Uzbekistan, this is something that China has already kind of accomplished, diversifying away from Russia, because it's using Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan.
Thank you so much, Niva. That was really informative. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today's discussion. I learned so much. I have to be honest with you. I was starting to panic because the events had been developing so quickly and there were so many moving parts. I'm sure many people in our audience felt the same way, but I think the three of you have been amazing in really breaking down this situation for us. So I cannot thank you enough. Max, Niva, Venera, thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. But we'll make sure that we'll keep an eye on the developments there, and we can reconvene perhaps right before the election in December. Again, I would like to thank our partner for this event, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And I would like to thank our audience, of course, for joining us. I would like to encourage all of you to sign up for FPRI emails so you will never miss out on our future coverage of the Eurasia region. So thank you very